Oh, Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. We are inside the brand new terminal here at PDX. Don't mind the grinding and the hammering because they've got a deadline to get this thing open by the middle of May. In just a few short months, it's going to be filled with trees, live music, businesses that charge the same inside as they do outside. It's my first time in here. I just wonder what your impressions are. Feel free to look up and look at that show-stopping roof if you want.
Yeah, it's a very exciting project. We obviously I go through a lot of U.S. airports. We fund a lot of U.S. airport projects, but this one is really distinctive, partly in how it's using a sense of place, using locally sourced wood and other features that really make this a gateway to the region. Partly features like the energy efficiency of it that most passengers will never see, but they're going to make a big difference to the bottom line. And then a much better passenger flow because of the layout and the fact that this will be able to take post 9/11 security flows into account in a way that older airport terminals don't. All of that's going to add up to a better passenger experience when this is open. And in the meantime, as you can hear around us, a lot of good paying construction jobs.
We'll circle back to passenger experience, consumer protection for travelers, because I know you and your department have been very active in that. I want to talk about a flight that took off from this very airport and then landed at this very airport, an emergency landing. This is Alaska 1282, back on January 5th. 177 passengers and crew on board. 6 minutes in, 14,000 feet. A panel of the plane, the door plug blew out on the left side. Everybody made it down safe. Everybody made it off alive. But passengers describing that experience as chaos, terrifying, panic-inducing. Alaska's CEO calling it, saying he was angry, disappointed, more than frustrated. What words would you choose to describe what happened on board?
It was shocking, and it should never have happened. We never take for 1 second the record that the United States has in passenger aviation safety. We never take for granted the fact that flying is the safest way to travel in the United States. And that means when there's an event like this, an incident like this, passengers go through what they went through on board. That requires really a national level response. Thanks to the professionalism of the crew, and remarkably, everyone was able to step off that plane just as they had stepped on. But it's critically important to take every lesson, especially about Boeing's practices and procedures, to make sure something like that can't happen again. It's why there wasn't just an immediate or very swift grounding of the aircraft ordered by the FAA administrator, but now a wholesale look at how quality control on Boeing's lines is being looked at with an audit that's underway as we speak, and even a look at the bigger framework from a regulatory perspective of how the FAA oversees those processes.
I know you can't comment on an ongoing investigation, but the NTSB's preliminary report, as I'm sure you're aware, found that it does not appear the bolts that are meant to hold that door plug in place were installed when Boeing and Spirit AeroSystems did some work before the aircraft was delivered to Alaska. Does that finding make you more worried, less worried?
Well, bottom line, it's unacceptable. As you acknowledged, the investigation is with NTSB. We respect their independence. But based on that preliminary finding, the next obvious question is how? How can that happen? How can an aircraft go into service with passengers getting on board when bolts are missing that need to be there for obvious reasons? That is part of not just what NTSB is looking at, but something that informs the investigative process that FAA has underway. We've got boots on the ground, both at Spirit AeroSystems, that supplier, and at Boeing itself, and need to make sure that just as so much work went into making sure that the design of the aircraft is safe, that also there's an equal level of confidence that the manufacturing of every single plane meets that design that's been certified to be safe.
I want to ask you about that confidence, but first, we know that United and Alaska both found missing or loose, I should say loose hardware on some of their MAX 9s. Have you been made aware of any cases where bolts were entirely missing or not reinstalled on other MAX 9s?
I'd refer you to the FAA for more of the details on that and the airlines in terms of their maintenance records. But what we know is that having ordered all of those inspections to take place, and the FAA ordered that as part of the process for safely returning them to the air, more issues turned up. And that tells you that there's a bigger systemic set of questions around Boeing and around their supplier.
Let me ask you about that. The FAA chief, Mike Whitaker, was before Congress last week. He said this, quote, "The current system is not working because it is not delivering safe aircraft." Do you agree with that, and why or why not?
Yeah, the safety tolerance of FAA is 1 in a billion when it comes to some of these kinds of situations. So obviously we recognize the safety record that has been achieved here, but we can't take it for granted. It is a remarkable fact that billions of passengers have gotten on and off airplanes in the last decade without a fatal crash. So what we now need to do is make sure that we don't treat that as just sort of something that's been achieved, a destination we've arrived at, and we can all sit back and be happy, but say, okay, what are the emerging threats to that? What's changing that could change that? What needs to be revised to sustain that safety level? So we're not going to be satisfied, even when you have a year with 0 commercial fatalities from airline crashes, because we need to look at the close calls and treat them just the same way that America used to treat the last crash.
So what do you do differently?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Boeing, of course, is under a microscope right now. FAA is looking at every step of their process to understand how not just their quality control, but really their safety culture works and what needs to change. But it's more than that. This is also leading to a look at the way that there is delegation of authority. This is a structure that Congress created in order to effectively divide up some of the labor and the expense of quality assurance between the manufacturer and the taxpayer. I think everything needs to be on the table right now, because what we've learned here should propel a set of actions to make sure, again, that every plane coming out of Boeing, that we have the confidence that it is 1,000% safe, and that everybody stepping onto one of those airplanes, as I did today, flying here to Portland on a Boeing 737, knows that they have all of that safety backing them up.
So you're referring to the fact that it is standard practice and long known as a cost-saving measure, rather, that Boeing employees act as inspectors on behalf of the FAA and sign off on various things along the way of the construction and the finishing of aircraft. Representative Colin Allred last week, Democrat from Texas, said, in order to have a truly safe system, it seems to me we cannot rely on the manufacturers themselves to be their own watchdogs. You alluded to this. Others have called it the fox guarding the hen house. So is it time to scrap that practice, full stop, and return the authority solely to the FAA?
Well, that's exactly what the administrator has called on Congress to reevaluate. Look, for every process where there's a regulation, there's then another process for certifying that the regulation has been met. On one extreme, you have, for example, poultry and meat inspections, where there's federal employees looking over the shoulders of manufacturers. For others, like in the auto industry, there's a recall system. Federal employees are not standing around in the factories looking at the cars, but we will issue as a department, recalls and require a change when there's an issue. Aviation in the U.S. sits somewhere in the middle of that, and I think there is a very good reason why everybody from our own department to some voices on Congress are asking about how to move that to where less of that responsibility sits in the manufacturer's hands. But in order for us to do that, we would need to add thousands of personnel and be budgeted accordingly. We can't do it without Congress.
So to draw you out there, you don't necessarily see that practice going away, but you see the balance shifting?
Well, I think all options have to be on the table right now. But the bottom line is that Boeing is responsible for meeting the safety standards that the FAA publishes, and the FAA will be looking over their shoulder to make sure that that's taking place.
And
exactly which personnel do that, that's exactly what needs to be reviewed and I think reevaluated right now. That's what Administrator Whitaker is calling.
When you say everything is on the table, does that include perhaps requiring Boeing or pushing Boeing to bring all manufacturing of big components like fuselages back in-house?
Well, I think there will always be some mix between vendors, suppliers, and the final manufacturer. So I think the real focus has to be to make sure that everybody in that chain, even if it's the subcontractor to a subcontractor, has the exact same level of safety and the exact same standard as the one whose brand name we all recognize. And that's something else that the FAA is looking at right now. It should be the case today, but just because that's true in theory doesn't mean we're accepting that it's the case in practice, especially after everything we've learned from this incident and are continuing to learn.
I want to ask you about the Boeing CEO, Dave Calhoun, and I know obviously there's some grinding going on back there. The construction continues. He has said things like, we caused the problem, we're committed to total transparency, more scrutiny will make us better, Boeing is accountable, and we simply must do better. Have you had conversations with the Boeing CEO, and what have you told him?
Yeah, I've spoken to him directly about our concerns, especially in the wake of this Alaska Airlines incident. and the need for Boeing to demonstrate with the avoidance of any doubt whatsoever that they are capable of not just designing safe aircraft, but building and delivering aircraft that meet those high design standards. I think he certainly understands our concern. He has said all of the right things, but it's not about what you say, it's about the results. And the results are what are being audited right now by the FAA.
How confident are you that we will find a better balance that not only fixes manufacturing issues and makes sure this never happens again, but also reassures the public and the perception that there's something wrong going on the assembly line in Renton?
Well, I have a lot of confidence in Administrator Whitaker's leadership, and what he said is there's no going back to business as usual at Boeing. And that's already the case. What needs to happen now is a process that everybody can feel 1,000% confident in. And frankly, that part is still under construction.
A few more aviation questions I just want to get to here, and then we'll move forward. The cockpit voice recorder on this particular aircraft was overwritten because they only record for 2 hours. The NTSB has long made a push to extend the recording time to 25 hours. Last November, the FAA said, yeah, we'll think about that. That sounds good, but only for new aircraft. The NTSB says, no, that's not good enough. We want to push to have them retrofitted on all CVRs. What's your approach? Where do you stand on whether or not cockpit voice recorders should be replaced on all aircraft in order to increase safety and lessons learned?
Yeah, you know, FAA was already working on this before the incident with the 737 MAX that took place in January. I think now we have one more data point on the importance of these cockpit voice recorders, and I think that adds to the urgency of updating the practice in accordance with what NTSB has put forward.
Okay, so you would support what the NTSB is calling for, retrofitting all CVRs on existing aircraft too?
So FAA is going to have more of the analysis on which aircraft can be done first, but I think the bottom line is that there's a compelling case for there to be access to more recording than there is right now.
Okay, and one other question related to Boeing, because we talked about a systemic issue. One of the things that happened on Alaska 1282 when the depressurization occurred is the cockpit door blew open. The pilots didn't know what was going on because it wasn't in the manual. To me, this has hallmarks of the MAX 8s, the MCAS system that wasn't in pilot manuals, it wasn't part of training, different incidents entirely, but it paints a picture, some might say, of a systemic issue of communication when it comes to communicating with pilots, providing critical information. How do you fix that kind of systemic issue?
Well, that particular case involves some technical and security aspects that are best spoken to by the FAA and the NTSB. But the bigger picture is that anybody who is involved in working on these aircraft, whether you're flying one as a pilot, taking care of passengers on board one as a flight attendant, or servicing one as a mechanic, needs to know exactly what is required in order to operate that aircraft safely. This was a big issue with the MCAS problem that was responsible for the MAX crashes that really first cast a light on Boeing's practices in the last decade. And it continues to be true. And it's part of what both FAA and I expect NTSB are going to be looking at.
Okay. One more aviation question for you. It's of particular concern to me. I spent some time in Asia Pacific and reported on this extensively for CNN. Next month is the 10-year anniversary of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines MH370. 239 passengers on board a Boeing 777 that essentially vanished without a trace. Now, there have been a few pieces that have been confirmed to be from that aircraft. 3 Americans on board, including a man named Philip Wood from Texas. My question for you is, would the U.S. support resuming the search for MH370, and what resources, including financial or otherwise, would it be willing to contribute?
That's really beyond the Department of Transportation. I'd be happy to refer you to the right people in the administration who have more of the context on that. What we know is that every time an American or anybody else gets on board a commercial aircraft, they should be 1,000% confident that they're going to get back off of that aircraft safely wherever they're going.
Okay. Let us talk about the Interstate Bridge a little bit. This is the I-5 bridge. It connects Los Angeles to Sacramento to Portland to Seattle. It is the main artery, the link on the West Coast. This week, it's going to be 107 years old. It's a $6 billion replacement project. I know that the federal government has already chipped in about $600 million. I know there's an application for a $1.5 billion grant, I think, through the Federal Highway Administration. States about $1 billion each. Altogether, we're probably about $2 billion short still. So my question for you is there more federal help where that came from to help get it done.
Well, I'm not going to make any news about grant announcements besides the $600 million that we're celebrating this week. But what I'll say is funding this project has required funding from multiple sources. And it's really been the willingness of the state of Oregon and the state of Washington to step up and lead with their own funds, as well as come to us and match those to federal funds, that's making all of this possible. This falls into a category of projects that are so large and so complex that they really would not have been possible, just would not have gotten over the finish line until the president's infrastructure package passed. That's why some of these programs were created in the first place. That's why we're excited to be able to bring these federal dollars to the table.
How would you describe the condition of the 107-year-old span?
Let's call it not good enough. And this is a vital connection, as anybody who makes that crossing knows. This is not something that we could easily work around if for any reason it were to go out of service. And while there are many bridges that have in common that they're nearing the end of their life, there are not a lot of bridges that have the particular amount of pressure, the economic significance, the amount of commuters that this I-5 bridge does. You add to that the seismic resilience, the question of making sure that every facility from this airport to our roads and bridges is ready for what could happen seismically. Just demonstrates just how urgent it is to get this done. I don't think there's been a lack of urgency. After all, there was an effort a decade ago to get this done. It's really been a lack of funding, and we're here to change that with these federal dollars from the president's infrastructure package.
All right, no promises today, but we could potentially see more. I want to flip back to consumer protections for air travelers here. Broadly speaking, how would you say U.S. airlines are doing when it comes to honoring their commitments? You give a broad grade, A through F. What would you say right now?
I would say incomplete. They have definitely taken some significant steps in response to the pressure that we put on them. More than $2 billion have gone back to passengers just since our administration arrived through refunds that we have pressed them to deliver. They changed their customer service plans after that terrible summer of 2022 when there were so many delays and cancellations, and I summoned the CEOs and said this can't happen again. That's when we created flightrights.gov, put up the dashboard with better information. All of that's improved, but I just don't think we can count on the airlines to improve on their own. That's why we're also pushing forward with regulations and enforcement to make sure that they have to provide a better experience, make sure that they have to do a better job of getting people's money back to them when it is owed them. And we're working on from family seating, not having to pay to sit next to your kids, to getting your money back if your bag is late or your Wi-Fi doesn't work. We're working on all of that right now with our regulatory powers.
And where are we on the rulemaking when it comes to requiring airlines to provide meals and hotels? Because I know that's something that's in the works that the president has also called for.
That's right. That's in the works right now. Hope to be able to make announcements later on this year. But I will add, actually, right now, almost all of the top 10 airlines have a requirement that we enforce that didn't exist a couple of years ago. If you get stuck and it's their fault on meals, ground transportation, rebooking, anything like that, that will be covered. And if they fail to cover it, let us know, because we're also finding that our enforcement actions have played a big role in this, most notably and most recently, the enforcement actions around Southwest after the meltdown that they experienced about a year ago.
Ask you briefly about air traffic controllers, because I know you may be visiting with some controllers here. There's a safety component. We're reportedly about 3,000 short across the country. My question is, what can you specifically do to boost air traffic controller ranks?
Well, at risk of sounding simplistic, the biggest thing we got to do is hire more air traffic controllers. Now, that's harder than it sounds, largely because of what it takes to train them. So we're expanding the ways that they can be trained, including the FAA administrators' initiative to have more ways for people through what are called CTIs. These are additional institutions that work alongside our training academy, meeting the same very high standard, but allowing for that funnel to be a little bit wider to get more controllers through. We also have in the president's budget funding for us to hire more controllers. It's one of many, 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 many reasons why I'm urging House Republicans not to continue this talk of a shutdown yet again, or let that happen, but to pass the president's budget so that we can do all of that hiring.
We just have a minute left here, and I'm mindful of your time. You just had a birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
The question is a favorite of mine. If you could go back and give your 16 or 17-year-old self some advice, what would it be?
My 16-year-old self was hoping to be an airline pilot, and life worked in a different way, but I guess I could tell my 16-year-old self that I was going to wind up working in transportation and aviation after all, just in a different way. It's the other thing I guess I'd want a young self to know, since at the time I was wrestling with my sexuality and whether that would prevent me from ever getting to serve, whether as a military officer or anything like the job I have now, was that things change in this country.
Yeah. What advice would you have for LGBTQ plus young people and teens who may see you as a role model?
Well, most importantly, that you're not alone, that I'm rooting for you, that whatever nasty politics is taking place right now, trying to take advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in the country, which is LGBTQ plus youth, that you've got a lot of people in your corner, including the President of the United States, people like me, and a lot of people who want you to succeed. It hasn't been easy, and the last couple of years have seen, unfortunately, some really cynical actions taken for political advantage at the expense of this community. But at the end of the day, the existence of my family is living proof of how much can change in a short amount of time in this country. And we're going to keep pushing until everybody knows that they can have that sense of belonging and safety that they deserve.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for your time.
Thank you.